Good afternoon, students. This is Mr. Verzat. Today we're going to continue our series of value drawing, and more specifically we're going to go a little bit deeper into implied line. I'm going to give you guys some tips and techniques on how to achieve that. So let's take a look at the middle of the frayer here at this image, and we're going to zoom in nice and close to get a good look at it. This, once again, is a value a drawing that's drawn only with implied line. And once again, an implied line is simply an area that is defined by its surrounding values. So let's get in here and see if we can pull out some implied lines. Well, an implied line, once again, is not a line in the conventional sense. Let me show you one. The outside of this arm right here, that's an implied line. There are no real lines that we're drawing this fuzzy outside area right here. Simply the dark areas were used to make it pop out. So this furry outside area, this arm, that's an implied line. This part of his belly, that's an implied line. This part of his cheek, that's an implied line, and likewise the inside of the ear and the under parts of the ear. Basically, an implied line would be an area where you've got a light thing next to a dark thing, or vice versa. And that is the secret to making a piece a value drawing. And once again, a value drawing is simply a drawing where there's no contour lines and you're simply using shading techniques and lots of different darks and lights to do it. This is done completely in hatching. As you can see, there's no blending done with a blending stump. It's all done on its own using the individual pencil strokes. So I don't expect you to do something at this level, but this is something to strive for. And hopefully after years of practice you can do this too, even better than me. We all know that implied lines are defined by their surrounding values. Well, how do you do that? Well, it's done by putting a dark plane next to a light plane. And a plane, in this class, is not defined as something that flies through the air. It's simply an area of space in your piece that is defined on all sides. So looking at this teddy bear arm, this light area where the highlight is, that is a plane. This dark area right next to the highlight, that is a plane as well, and so on. So how do you do it? It creates contrast. Now contrast means difference. The difference between the darkness and the light there. That's what makes it look as if it's rising up off of his belly right there. And that's what makes it look furry on the outside, because there's a dark shadow right behind it. We'll go into more details to what contrast is later, but just to let you know, the rule of thumb is think light to dark to light to dark to light to dark, and so on. That's how you work in a value piece. You put a light thing next to a dark thing in order for that light thing to stand out, or vice versa. An example of weak contrast would be if there is no darkness in your piece. It's a common mistake for beginners to have just very, very light work. Even their shadows are very light gray. Well, once again, going back to drawing with confidence, you need your dark values in order to pull this off. And don't be afraid of the dark. Looking at this picture again, remember the breakdown of how much of each type of value is usually in a piece. Black, your darkest shades, is generally 20 to 30%. So there's really not that much of it. It's mostly all mid-tone. So if you think in terms of percentages of your work, how much of it to add, that'll help guide you as a beginner. So how do you do it? Just like any drawing, you start with a pre-drawing and maybe even a lightly drawn contour drawing. Those lines will naturally need to be as light as your lightest value in there because we want them to go away. The next step is to block in your values, as we've talked about before. And that's just to give you a roadmap so you can know where your values go. And then finally, you layer over the top of that, going from light to dark. Now, why light to dark? Well, it gives you more control over what you do, and it fills in the gaps between your strokes better. In a way, you don't really need your blending stump to begin with if you do it like this. So you're going over an area multiple times and that fills it in. How does it give you more control? Well, it's easier to add dark than it is to take away. And you're constantly going through your piece, looking at your darker regions and saying, hey, do I need to bump that up? Also, you're looking at your lighter regions. Hey, do I need to take something away there? And also you're looking at your mid-tone areas, thinking, okay, do I need to spread it out a little further? Another tip is to treat your values as if they were individual shapes on their own. This helps you to make sense of what you're doing, one value at a time. Let's take a look at this piece. See how this outside area of this arm right down here, it looks like the shape of an S? Well, that's what I was thinking of when I was drawing it. I treated that dark area that blended into the midtone of his belly, I treated that as if it was its own shape. And then likewise with the side of this arm right here for this part of the shadow, I treated this kind of a letter J or letter C kind of a shape as if it was its own shape as well. You're constantly treating your values as if they're their own individual forms. That'll help you make sense of what you're doing. And finally, when you're all done, you blend your values together. And once again, you do that simply by, if you have this really harsh dark area right here, well, you want a hard edge, a harsh hard edge right here to define this part of his hand, right? But we don't want a hard edge for the rest of this. We want it to softly blend into its neighbor values. Well, you do that by just layering it in. So if you have a hard edge, you just pull that out a little bit into your midtone. Use the pressure on your pencil that would be in between what you used for this value and then your midtone. So if you did your midtone at, say, a pressure 2, and you did your dark shadow at a pressure 3, you could do a 2.5, 2.25, just somewhere in there. You're using the values in between those pressures to achieve that blend. And once again, it's still individual strokes, but it will blend if you layer it. Alrighty, let's look at some examples. Here's an example of some student work, and this lady, she's a really good artist. She draws for fun, and you can sure see in her work, but she was learning the techniques just like you were. And once again, going over how talent works, talent simply means you pick it up quicker. That's all. And you get that joy out of it. But if we look at this is part of a flower still life that we worked on. And she understood a grasp of the technique on how you can tell where your light sources are. So this student, how did she do it? Well, she drew the petals by using the darkness, the dark values around it, putting dark planes beside light planes. Think light to dark, light to dark, light to dark, light to dark. And let's kind of get in here and take a closer look. All right, look at this. We've got light to dark, and then there's a light thing in front of that, and then it gradually shades into a dark thing, because we're looking at our light source the whole time. And then we put a light thing in front of that, and then that thing gradually shades into a dark thing like normal, and then we put another light thing in front of that, and then that thing shades into another dark thing just like normal. And flower petals are pretty complex, but they do a great job of showing that progression from light to dark and light to dark and light to dark. Let's look at the teddy bear. Let's look at light to dark. Well, once again, if we look at his left arm right over here, there's a lightness on the outside, and then there's a dark shadow, and then it goes to light. And then how do we show the edge of that lightness in his arm? Well, we put it next to a dark thing on his belly, and then even that starts to shade to light. And how do we define the outside edge of his belly? Well, we put a dark thing, dark shadow, where his arm's at, where his leg is at, and then that thing starts to turn light also. And especially around the outsides of his, the right arm over here, if we put a darker background behind him, that would help the lightness show out even more. So light to dark, light to dark. Think of that. You can know where to do this by studying your light, where it's hitting your subject. Remember the cube exercises. Think of your light source. Where is the light coming from? Where is it going? Where is it hitting? What's not being hit? Consider your light source. Block in those values. And you know what? It's the exact same if you're blocking in a sphere or blocking in a bunch of complex flower petals. Same exact principle, just a little bit more time is involved. So where are the contour lines? How did this student do it? Well, the drawing began with very light contours, and they were eventually shaded out. She pre-drew it. I watched her from beginning to end. The top of that flower right there was just a big semicircular oval, pre-drawn sketch. Those leaves, those were ovals also. And then she went in and defined her outside lines, just like normal, and made sure it was very light. And then she started light to dark. She blocked in her values, kind of a little roadmap on where things were at in her piece, and she was looking at a real flower the whole time, so it's not like it came out of the head, out of her brain. But she put her lightest values down first, and at the end, the last thing she put in were the darkest of the dark ones, and she shaded her lines out. That's how she did it. So let's take a look at some non-examples. Some non-examples would include work that's abstract, like this color wheel, work that is not something that exists in everyday real life, and therefore you don't need a light source and you don't need to define your values. This is abstract expressionist art. You know, even though it's built around some rules, this is not something that you see in nature. That's a non-example of when you would not use all of these techniques for implied line. Here's also an example of work that did not use implied line. As you can see, it's mainly drawn out of contour lines, and likewise there is no value added to it. Here's a typical beginner mistake. You can tell if you're doing something wrong when making a value drawing if it lacks value, if there's a lot of white in there. Really, if you're going to do a value drawing, most of it's midtone, because once again, midtone is what something looks like in natural light if it were in a black and white world. So your white is almost your tiniest bit of the value drawing. You don't want to have a lot of white in it. So if you see lots of contour lines and a lot of white, you're doing something wrong, okay? One thing the student could have done is to include like the midtone as their skin tone. So rather than all white skin, I mean, even the most pale albino person, if you take a black and white photo of them, you know, there's still value on their skin. It's a shade of gray. The only white areas would be where the light's directly hitting, and those are very few and far between. So one thing this student could have done is include the skin tone. That means they would have had to lay down in the value with all their pencil anyway. There would be no white down there. And they could have defined, say, let's look at the bridge of the nose. They could have defined that by removing value in some areas where the light would directly hit. And that is one way to give it definition. Likewise, they could have put a shade where the light is not hitting. And that would have helped the nose come up in 3D. And as a matter of fact, we're going to look at that in a couple of seconds in the demo. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take that exact same picture and kind of mess around with it in Photoshop, and I'm going to do a digital painting, sort of, the exact same way that you guys would shade, trying to see how this nose could have been converted into a value drawing. Now we're going to assume the light source is coming from the upper right. It's coming right down here, and following your rules of value, I'm just going to block in the values here. And I'm going to speed it up as I do this to save time. So right here would be a good shape for where the student's highlight could be. As you can see, I just kind of blocked in the value right there where it would be. And let's take a look and see if we can find where a good area for the shadow would be. We could have a shadow right underneath the nose because the light's coming from the top right. That means this under part of the nose is going to be really dark. Now I know it's kind of confusing because noses are really weird, but the same principle applies with any form. I also see there could be a shadow right over here from like where the bridge comes down, and then on this side of the nose as well. And we could also maybe tuck a little shadow in here because it looks like there's a rounded nose tip, you know, just to define it a little bit more. So if this area down here, and then I kind of connected it here, goes all the way up here, if that's a shadow, and this is a highlight, well, where's the midtone at? Well, everything that I didn't touch. That would be everything here, here, and here. As a matter of fact, let's label it just to be safe. Midtone, 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 highlight over here, shadow, shadow. So I'm going to go in there and I'm just going to start laying some shadows down. Let's speed it up. Okay, so here's an example of what it might look like as if it were a value drawing. So let's just turn off the line art. Bam! Yeah, a little bit more defined. Still kind of sloppy, but you know, it just kind of gives it more definition and value, and you're thinking, where's your highlight, midtone, and shade at? And, you know, compare it to before with line work, and what would it look like as a value drawing? Well, think of your highlight, midtone, and shade, and you just lay those in there. And let's see what it looks like if we were to have this line drawing turn into the nose. Well, that was just an example of how you can draw using your values and how to know where certain values can go and how to draw light to dark, and it makes it look cooler. So, as always, look forward to seeing you in class, and have a great day.